The alarm in the arena had not even finished its first cycle when Mira Ashworth stepped onto the mat, and I already knew someone was going to regret this day. I am Callum Reeve, and I was standing on the observation deck with my hands pressed against the cold glass, watching my closest friend walk into a fight that 3 cadets thought she could never win. 4 months earlier, those same 3 cadets had cornered her in a service corridor behind our training hangar and left her on the floor with broken ribs and no one to answer for it. Now she was back, and the whole academy had gathered to see what would happen next. Mira came from Earth, a planet the rest of the galaxy calls a Deathworld, not because it is cruel for no reason, but because every living thing on it had to fight for a place to exist. Her people did not grow up with soft air and gentle skies. They grew up with storms that could flatten cities, animals that could end a life in seconds, and a pull of gravity that never once took a day off. I did not understand any of that when I first met her. I only knew she was quiet, careful with her words, and kinder to me than most people from my own homeworld had ever been. The 3 cadets waiting across the arena were from the Dravith cohort, a proud warrior line with thick frames and a long history of victories in low-gravity combat. Their leader, a broad cadet named Silas, stood with his arms folded and a grin that did not reach his eyes. Beside him stood Grant, lean and quick, and behind them both stood Corin, who had said nothing since the match was announced. These 3 had once believed that hurting a small human girl would go unnoticed. They were about to learn how wrong that belief had been. I remember the silence in the crowd before the signal sounded. Nobody spoke. Even the instructors, who usually kept a professional distance during cadet matches, leaned forward with real interest. Word had spread fast through every dormitory on the station. This was not just a training exercise. This was a reckoning that Mira had chosen for herself, in front of witnesses, on her own terms. The signal rang out, sharp and sudden, and Silas moved first. He came across the mat with the same confidence he must have carried into that corridor months ago, expecting the same result. He was larger, heavier, and trained for exactly this kind of gravity. What he did not expect was that Mira had spent every single day of her leave preparing her body and her mind for this exact moment. She did not retreat. She stepped inside his reach, turned her hips the way a person turns a key in a lock, and used his own forward motion against him. He hit the mat hard enough that the entire deck seemed to hum under my feet. It was over in under 2 minutes, and Silas needed help standing up. The crowd did not cheer. They simply watched, stunned, as Mira turned to face Grant. Grant was faster than Silas, and he knew it. He circled her instead of rushing in, testing her patience, waiting for an opening. I could see Mira's breathing was already elevated, her ribs still tender from injuries that had never fully finished healing, but her eyes never left him. When he finally struck, she was already moving, already reading the shift in his shoulder before his arm had fully extended. She caught his wrist, turned her whole body with the motion instead of resisting it, and brought him down in one clean motion that looked almost gentle from where I stood, though I knew it was anything but. Grant tapped out before the count reached 5. During that second match, my mind kept drifting back to the weeks right after Mira left the academy, weeks I had spent worried that she would never come back at all. She sent me only a handful of messages during that time, short and practical, telling me almost nothing about what she was actually doing. I later learned that she had spent those months on a training ground her family had used for generations, a place with steep hills, thin trails, and weather that changed without warning. She ran those hills every morning before sunrise. She practiced falling and rising again, until her body no longer flinched from impact. She studied recordings of every match Silas, Grant, and Corin had ever fought in official academy records, watching the same clips over and over until she could predict their habits before they even moved. None of that had been forced on her by any instructor or any rule. She had chosen every hour of it herself, quietly, without asking anyone for permission or sympathy. That left Corin. Corin had not moved from his spot since the match began. He looked at Mira for a long moment, then looked at his 2 friends being helped off the mat, and then he did something none of us expected. He stepped back, raised both hands, and forfeited the match without a single strike thrown. Later I learned he transferred to another training facility within the week and never returned to our station again. Mira stood alone in the center of the arena, breathing hard, her fists still raised out of habit rather than need. Nobody in that crowd said a word for a long moment. Then, slowly, the applause began, and it grew until the whole deck was shaking with the sound of it. I made my way down to the arena floor as fast as the crowd would allow me, pushing past cadets from a dozen different worlds who were still talking about what they had just witnessed. When I finally reached her, she was sitting on the edge of the mat, one hand pressed carefully against her side, breathing slow and steady like someone counting down from a great fear that had finally passed. I asked her the same question I had been carrying since the day I found her in that corridor floor months earlier. I asked her why she had never simply reported the 3 cadets to the Academy board. The evidence existed. The corridor camera had captured everything, even if the footage mysteriously vanished from the system soon after. She could have ended this with paperwork and a quiet disciplinary hearing, instead of standing alone against 3 trained fighters. She looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something settle in her expression, something that looked almost like peace. She told me that a punishment handed down by an authority feels like something that happened to a person from the outside. It does not change how that person sees themselves. It does not change how they see the one they hurt. But a defeat earned in full view, chosen freely and faced without hiding, changes everything. Silas, Grant, and even Corin would carry this day with them for the rest of their training, and long after that too. They would remember exactly what they had underestimated, and they would never make that mistake again with anyone from her world. I sat beside her while the medical staff checked her over, insisting she was fine, even as she winced with every deep breath. I thought about the first day she arrived at our dormitory, quiet and careful, arranging her belongings with a kind of precision I had never seen before. I thought about the late nights she spent helping me understand equations I could not grasp on my own, and the way she had cried once in the dark over something from her homeworld that she never explained to me, and I had pretended to be asleep because I did not know what else to do. I also thought back to the exact morning I had found her on the corridor floor, 40 minutes after she had missed a study session she had never once missed before. She had not called for help. She had not tried to crawl toward the nearest sensor panel to raise an alarm. I found her simply lying still, staring at the ceiling, breathing carefully around the pain in her ribs, and when she saw me she did not ask me to be angry on her behalf. She only asked me to sit with her for a while before either of us said anything at all. I remember calling the medical bay with a shaking voice while she stayed calm beside me, and I remember thinking, even then, that whatever she was feeling underneath that calm was something far more complicated than fear. The Academy's disciplinary office called her in twice during her recovery, asking for the names of the cadets responsible so they could open a formal case. Both times she declined to give them, and both times the officers seemed almost relieved to let the matter quietly fade from their workload. I was angry about that for a long time, angrier than she ever allowed herself to be, because it felt like the system meant to protect cadets like her had simply chosen the easier path instead of the right one. It was only much later, sitting beside her on that arena mat, that I finally understood she had never been waiting on the system to deliver justice for her in the first place. I had been afraid of her once, in the beginning, the way most cadets from gentler worlds are quietly afraid of anyone from Earth. We grow up hearing stories about that planet, about creatures with teeth built for tearing, about storms that erase entire towns in a single night, about a species that clawed its way to the top of its own world through nothing but stubborn refusal to stop existing. I had expected someone hard and cold. Instead, I found someone who worried about my grades before her own, who remembered small details about my life that even I sometimes forgot, who only became the thing the stories described when there was finally a real reason to become it. The days after the match were strange in a way I had not expected. Cadets who had never spoken to Mira before suddenly wanted to know her. Instructors who had quietly ignored the incident in the corridor now found reasons to mention her name with something close to respect. Even members of other proud fighting cultures on the station, species who rarely acknowledged human cadets as equals, began to watch her training sessions with quiet interest. But Mira did not change. That was the part that surprised me most. She did not walk taller through the halls or accept the sudden attention with anything more than a polite nod. She kept the same quiet habits, the same careful routines, the same late-night study sessions where she helped me with subjects I still struggled to understand. The only difference I noticed was that she slept more easily. The tension that had lived behind her eyes since the day of the attack was finally gone. A few weeks later, during a routine simulation exercise, our training group was assigned a joint mission with cadets from several other cohorts, including a handful from the Dravith line. I worried, quietly, that old tensions might return, that pride might demand another confrontation. Instead, something else happened. During a difficult stage of the simulation, when our team's shuttle system failed under a pressure test none of us had trained for, it was Mira who kept her calm, while alarms blared through the simulated cabin. She walked 2 Dravith cadets through an emergency restart sequence step by step, her voice steady even as the simulated hull groaned around us. And when the exercise ended successfully, one of those same cadets turned to her and offered something I never expected to hear from that cohort. He thanked her, plainly and without pride standing in the way, and told her she had saved the exercise for all of them. I realized then that the story of what happened in that arena was never really about revenge at all. Mira had never wanted to hurt Silas or Grant or Corin simply for the sake of hurting them back. She wanted something far more lasting than that. She wanted to be seen clearly, once and for all, not as someone to be underestimated or dismissed, but as someone whose kindness was a choice and not a weakness. Late one evening, weeks after the match, we sat together on the observation deck overlooking the training arena, now empty and quiet under the low station lighting. I asked her the question I had been holding on to since the day she returned. I asked her why humans were like this, capable of such gentleness and such fierce determination within the very same person. She thought about it for a long moment before answering. She told me that her people never got to choose the world they were born into. They did not choose the storms or the long nights or the endless struggle simply to stay alive long enough to see another sunrise. What they did choose, generation after generation, was how they would respond to all of it. They could have let the difficulty of their world make them cruel. Instead, most of them chose to protect each other fiercely, to build homes and communities, and quiet acts of kindness in the middle of all that hardship, while still keeping, deep down, the readiness to stand and fight whenever that kindness was tested by someone who mistook it for weakness. I thought about my own homeworld then, gentle and safe, in ways Earth had never been allowed to be, and I wondered if I would have been able to do what she did, if I would have had the patience to wait 4 months and train quietly rather than lash out immediately, or the courage to walk into that arena alone against 3 larger opponents with nothing but her own preparation to rely on. Our final year at the academy passed differently after that day. Mira continued her studies with the same quiet focus she always had, though now instructors from several departments quietly requested her for advanced training modules, recognizing something in her that went beyond simple physical skill. She never spoke about the corridor incident again, not even when younger cadets, having heard the story through years of retelling, asked her directly about it. She would simply tell them that the past was the past, and that the only thing worth carrying forward from any difficult day was the lesson it left behind. On the day we graduated, standing together on the main platform overlooking the station's central dock, I watched Silas among the crowd of graduating cadets. He caught my eye briefly, then found Mira standing beside me, and for the first time since I had known either of them, he offered her a small, respectful nod. She returned it without hesitation, the same calm expression she always carried, no trace of old anger left behind in her face at all. I understood then that the story people would tell about that day in the arena would probably grow with each retelling, the way stories always do, gaining details that never happened and losing the quiet, careful truth of what actually occurred. They would remember the 3 defeated cadets and the crowd that fell silent in shock. What they would likely forget, unless someone like me wrote it down clearly, was the girl who cried quietly in the dark over something she never explained, who helped a nervous roommate with difficult coursework late into the night, who kept every promise she ever made no matter how small, and who only ever raised her hand to defend herself and never once to seek out harm for its own sake. Years later, long after we had both left the academy for posts scattered across different parts of the galaxy, I received a message from Mira letting me know she had been assigned to lead a joint training program designed to help cadets from gentler worlds build confidence and resilience before facing real challenges in the field. I was not surprised at all. She had always understood something that took the rest of us far longer to learn, that true strength was never about seeking out conflict, but about being ready to meet it calmly whenever it found you, and about choosing, every single day afterward, to remain kind anyway. Not long before graduation, our class was sent on a short survival exercise on a moon with thin air and jagged rock formations, meant to test how well we handled real discomfort rather than simulated versions of it. Halfway through the second day, a sudden drop in temperature caught several cadets unprepared, including 2 from cohorts that had rarely spoken to either of us before. Mira did not hesitate. She redistributed thermal gear from her own pack, walked the group through building a proper shelter against the wind, and kept spirits high with a kind of steady humor I had not seen from her since before the corridor. By the time rescue transports arrived the next morning, every cadet on that moon knew her name, not because of the arena anymore, but because of a night none of them would have gotten through as easily without her. It struck me then that the story people told about Mira had quietly changed shape. It was no longer only about the day she stood alone against 3 opponents. It had become a story about someone who showed up, again and again, for anyone who needed her, long after the arena lights had gone dark. I still think about that day in the arena whenever I train new cadets of my own now. I tell them the story exactly as it happened, without exaggeration, because the truth of it was already remarkable enough on its own. I tell them about a quiet girl from a difficult world who was underestimated by cadets who should have known better, who disappeared for a season not to hide but to prepare, and who returned not seeking cruelty but simply demanding, once and for all, to be seen accurately for exactly who she was. And every time I finish telling it, I remind them of the one detail that matters most, the detail people are most likely to forget, in all the excitement of the arena, and the crowd, and the sudden defeat of 3 overconfident cadets. Mira never once threw the first strike in her entire life at that academy. Not in the corridor, where she had every reason to defend herself and simply could not in time, and not in the arena either, where she waited, patient and controlled, for each of her opponents to commit first before she ever moved to answer them. That, I have come to believe, was the real lesson of that entire year, more important than any single victory on any single mat. The strongest people I have ever known are rarely the ones looking for a reason to prove themselves. They are the quiet ones, the careful ones, the ones who would rather help you understand a difficult equation at midnight than ever raise a hand against you, right up until the moment someone forces their hand and leaves them no other choice at all. They attacked the wrong cadet's friend that day in the corridor, believing that kindness and gentleness meant there would be no consequence waiting for them down the road. They learned, in front of the entire academy, exactly how mistaken they had been. And I have never once forgotten the lesson that Mira Ashworth taught all of us that day. The lesson she carried quietly with her long after the applause had faded and the crowd had gone home. Some of the gentlest people you will ever meet are also the ones most fully prepared, when the moment finally arrives, to stand their ground without flinching, and to make certain that whoever tested them never forgets exactly why they should never have tried.